You ever get a phone call that doesn't just interrupt your day, it changes your entire life? One moment, you're standing in the middle of an ordinary morning, thinking about nothing more than what to eat for lunch or what job to finish before sunset. And the next, everything you thought you understood about your world, your family, yourself, just collapses. Like the air gets sucked out of the sky and you're left standing there, trying to breathe in a life that doesn't fit anymore. That's what happened to me. It was a Thursday morning, sometime in late February. The kind of cold where your breath looks like smoke and even the wood feels frozen in your hands. I was out front on my porch, fixing a loose rail that had been bugging me for weeks. I had my old toolbox open beside me, the smell of sawdust and motor oil mixing in the air. That scent always reminded me of home, of work, of simpler times. The morning sun was weak, just a pale stripe of light cutting through the gray sky. I remember thinking it was going to snow later. Then my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I wiped my hands on my jeans, reached for it, and smiled when I saw the name. Emily, my daughter, my pride, my reason to wake up every morning since her mom walked out. I hadn't heard her voice in a couple of days, and even though she'd been busy planning her wedding, she always made time to call. That's who she was: thoughtful, gentle, the kind of daughter any father would thank God for. I answered on the second ring, already smiling. "Hey, pumpkin," I said, trying to sound casual. "You getting excited for the big day yet?" There was a pause, not long enough to notice if you weren't listening for it, but I knew my daughter's breathing. I knew her moods, and something in that pause felt heavy, like a weight pressing down the line. "Dad," her voice was soft, almost distant. I could tell she was somewhere quiet, maybe outside, maybe sitting in her car. I need to tell you something." I chuckled, trying to lighten whatever was on her mind. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Cold feet already?" Another silence, and then in the smallest voice I'd ever heard from her, she said, "Dad, I don't want you to come to the wedding." At first I actually laughed. I thought it was a joke, a weird prank. I said, "You mean don't come early? I promise I'll stay out of the way, won't embarrass you. I won't even tell that story about the lemonade stand again." But she didn't laugh. "Dad," she said, firmer this time. "No, I mean it, I don't want you there." It felt like the air went still. My hand froze around the hammer, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. "Emily," I said carefully, my voice catching in my throat, "what are you talking about?" Her voice cracked. "It's just better this way. Jake's father will walk me down the aisle." Jake, her fiancé, a man I thought I respected. He was quiet, well-mannered, the kind of guy who shook your hand with both of his like he meant it. He called me sir, even after I told him not to. I trusted him. I welcomed him into our family. And now, here was my daughter telling me that his father, a man I barely knew, would be taking my place on the most important day of her life. I felt my throat tighten. "Jake's father," I said slowly. "Honey, why? Did I do something wrong? You can tell me." There was a small sound on the other end, like she was crying or trying not to. Then she whispered, "Dad, please, don't make this harder." And then she hung up. Just like that. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence. I stood there staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again. It didn't. I looked out over the empty street, the wind cutting through the trees, and I swear it felt like the world had gone hollow. The sound of traffic in the distance faded. The hammer slipped out of my hand, hitting the wood with a dull thud. And then came the echo of her words, "Don't come to the wedding." Over and over. It's funny how the smallest sentence can split your life into two halves, before and after. Before that call, I was a father preparing for the proudest day of his life. After that call, I was a man standing alone on a porch, wondering where he went wrong. I sat down on the steps, the cold biting through my jeans, and just stared at the road. I didn't cry right away. It's strange, people think heartbreak is loud. It's not. It's quiet. It's the silence that hits you hardest when your mind's racing but your body's frozen. After a while, I stood up and went inside. The house felt different, heavier, like every memory was watching me. Photos of Emily on the wall, her graduation picture, the one of her in her cap and gown with me standing beside her, beaming like a fool. Her smile in that photo could light up a room. Now looking at it, all I could see was distance. That night I didn't sleep, not a wink. I sat in my old armchair by the window, lights off, listening to the clock tick. I kept thinking maybe she's just stressed. Maybe someone told her something. Maybe I said something wrong without realizing it. I replayed every conversation, every text, every joke, trying to find the moment it all went wrong. The mind does cruel things when it's looking for answers. It invents reasons when none are given. By midnight, I found myself whispering out loud, "What kind of father gets uninvited to his own daughter's wedding?" No one answered. The house was still, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the wind pressing against the windows. I thought about calling her again, but pride or maybe fear stopped me. What if she didn't pick up? What if she meant it? So I just sat there, staring at the empty space where her laughter used to live. The wedding was still a month away, but in that moment I already felt like I'd lost her. And what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, was that this phone call was only the first crack in something much bigger. A crack that would open up to reveal lies buried so deep, I'd start questioning whether I ever really knew my own family at all. That Thursday morning, standing on that porch with the wind cutting through me, I thought my heart had just been broken. I didn't realize yet it was only the beginning of my story. A week. That's how long it took for my world to twist itself into something unrecognizable. A week of unanswered calls, unread messages, and nights spent staring at a dark ceiling wondering what kind of father I had become to deserve silence from the one person I loved more than my own life. Every time my phone buzzed, I'd snatch it up like a drowning man grabbing at a rope. But it was never her. Just bills, spam, or reminders of a life that no longer felt like mine. Then came that afternoon, the one that stripped away every illusion I had left. It was a gray day, the kind where the sky looks tired and heavy, like it's holding back tears of its own. I'd been running errands just trying to keep busy. Because when your heart's cracked open, the worst thing you can do is sit still. That's when the thoughts creep in. I remember passing by Miller's Diner, that old spot off the highway where I used to take Emily for pancakes when she was little. I don't even know why I slowed down. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe God himself wanted me to see. Because right there, parked by the curb, was Jake's truck. His big silver Dodge with that dent on the back bumper I helped him fix last summer. At first I smiled. Maybe this was fate giving me a shot, a chance to talk man to man, clear the air, fix whatever misunderstanding had poisoned my daughter against me. I parked across the street and walked toward the window, but before I could reach the door I looked through the glass. And that's when the world stopped. Jake wasn't alone. Across from him, laughing softly with that same tilt of the head I once thought was beautiful, sat Linda, my ex-wife, Emily's mother. For a second, I couldn't even process it. My brain refused to connect the dots. It felt like watching a movie where you already know the ending, but you still can't believe it's real. They looked comfortable, familiar, the kind of easy laughter that only comes from two people who share more than small talk. She reached out and touched his hand across the table. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. I felt the air leave my lungs. My knees went weak, and I had to steady myself on the hood of a car parked nearby. My mind screamed no, but my eyes wouldn't stop seeing it. Linda and Jake, my daughter's fiancé, my ex-wife. Something inside me broke, not with a loud snap but quietly, like the slow tearing of paper. Without thinking, I pulled my phone out and snapped a picture. My hands were shaking, but I needed proof. Because I knew, when you tell people something like this, they never believe you without it. I waited. They stayed there another 20 minutes, talking like old lovers who had the world to themselves. Then they stood up, paid the bill, and walked out side by side. I followed, keeping my distance, heart pounding so hard it hurt. They drove off and I tailed them through town, past the old gas station, across the bridge, and out toward Route 82, that stretch of road where motels sit in silence, hiding other people's sins. When they pulled into one, my hands started trembling so bad I almost dropped the phone. Jake opened the motel door. Linda stepped inside first. He followed. The door shut behind them. That flickering neon sign, vacancy, kept flashing red and white against my windshield. I sat there frozen, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Every part of me screamed to storm in there and demand answers, but another part, the part that had already been broken too many times, knew it wouldn't change a damn thing. They made their choice. When I finally drove home, I didn't turn on the radio, didn't make a sound, just listened to the hum of the engine and the hollow thud of my heartbeat. I parked in the driveway and stayed there till morning, staring at nothing. At sunrise, I decided I needed to hear the truth, not from them but from her, from Emily, because if there was even a chance she didn't know, I had to give her that chance. I went to her apartment. My hands were shaking as I knocked. When she opened the door, she looked like hell, eyes puffy, face pale, hair tied back like she hadn't slept in days. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she asked, voice trembling. I didn't waste a second. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear myself speak. "Tell me you didn't know," I said. Her face drained of color. The tears welled up before she could even blink them back. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. That silence, that single, unbearable moment, told me everything I needed to know. "You knew," I whispered. My throat felt raw like I'd swallowed glass. "You knew, and you still told me not to come to your wedding." "Dad, please," she finally said, voice breaking. "It's not what you think." I stepped back, shook my head. I couldn't bear to hear the excuses, the twisted explanations that people give when they've already chosen the wrong side. "You let her do this," I said quietly. "You let her take everything from me again." Then I turned and walked away. I could hear her crying behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look back, because if I did, I might have fallen apart right there on her doorstep. Driving home, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't just betrayal. This was history repeating itself. Linda had destroyed me once before, and now, through Jake, through Emily, she'd found a way to do it again. Only this time, I wasn't going to just take it. This time, I'd make sure the truth didn't just come out. I'd make sure it burned every lie they ever told. Weeks bled into months, but time did nothing to dull the pain. It just spread it out thinner like paint smeared across glass, still visible no matter how many layers you try to cover it with. Every morning I'd wake up hoping that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare had ended. But it hadn't. The world had moved on, except me. I was stuck, buried alive under the weight of what my own blood had done. I stopped answering the phone. People tried to check in at first, friends, neighbors, even my sister calling from Texas, but I couldn't bring myself to pick up. What would I say? "Hey, my daughter disinvited me from her wedding because she's protecting the man who's sleeping with her mother." Yeah, that wasn't exactly coffee talk material. So I let the phone ring. Let the texts pile up. Let the world forget me because I already felt forgotten. Days turned into a fog. I didn't shave, didn't eat much. I'd sit in my recliner, staring out the window at the empty street, feeling like a ghost in my own house. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered, tired eyes, gray creeping through my beard, hands that used to build things now trembling from too much whiskey and not enough sleep. But pain, real gut-deep pain, has this strange way of sharpening things. It can break you, sure, but sometimes it clears the fog too. One night, as the clock ticked past 2 a.m., I sat in that same chair and thought, if they were capable of doing this behind my back, what else had they done? That question started eating at me like acid. I couldn't let it go. My mind replayed old memories, small details I'd brushed off at the time, Linda being too busy to talk about money near the end of our marriage, Jake always having the newest tools and trucks for his so-called contracting business, even though no one I knew had ever actually hired him. It didn't add up. So I started digging. I wasn't a detective, but years of being married to Linda had taught me how to read between the lines. She'd always been slick with money, organized, she'd call it, but I knew the truth. She was sneaky, knew how to move things around without leaving fingerprints. And Jake, he had that same easy smile, that same too smooth confidence. It was almost eerie how alike they were. A few days later, I called up an old buddy, Mike Donovan. He used to work down at the county records office before he retired. A good guy, sharp as ever, the kind who still owed me a favor or two. When he picked up, his voice was the same as I remembered, slow, thoughtful, with that drawl that made every sentence sound like he was halfway through a story. "Mike, it's Richard," I said, trying to sound casual even though my heart was hammering. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "Haven't heard that voice in a long time. You still alive up there?" "Barely," I said with a dry laugh. "Listen, I need a little help with something off the record." He paused. "Depends what you're asking." "I need you to check a business for me, something called J&L Home Improvements. I think it's a small contracting outfit here in town." He grunted. "Yeah, I can take a peek. You think they owe you money or something?" I didn't answer that, just let me know what you find. 2 hours later he called me back. His voice was different this time, tighter, uneasy. "Richard," he said, "you better sit down." That's never a good sentence to hear. He sighed. "That company's co-owned by two people, a Jake Turner and a Linda Hayes." For a second I didn't understand what I was hearing. My mind lagged behind like it refused to process the words. "Say that again," I said quietly. "Linda Hayes," he repeated. "That's her maiden name, right? The one she used before you two got married." I felt my stomach twist into knots, the kind of pain that isn't physical but still feels like a knife. Linda had gone back to her maiden name after the divorce, and now she was running a business with my daughter's fiancé. It got worse. Mike cleared his throat. "One more thing, buddy. The company's registered to your old address, the one you and Linda shared before the split." I nearly dropped the phone. My hands went cold. My home, was the official mailing address for their little side hustle. "Mike," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you're telling me they're using my old house for their business?" "Yep, and looks like it's been running for about a year. They've been pulling in decent money, too. Big renovation contracts, landscaping deals, hell, ones even with the city." I couldn't breathe. My head was spinning. I sat down on the edge of the bed and just stared at the floor, trying to keep my heart from punching through my chest. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It wasn't about love or jealousy or family drama. They were profiting off me, using my name, my property, my past. Every memory, every part of my life they touched, they were selling it like it belonged to them. I thought about Emily, about her knowing this, about her keeping quiet while the people she loved most used me like a stepping stone. And that thought cut deeper than anything else. Because betrayal from a lover is one thing, but from your own child, that's a wound that never heals. That night I couldn't sit still. I tore through my old files, my boxes, anything that still connected me to that house or to Linda. And the more I found, the sicker I felt. Invoices, tax forms, insurance papers, all still had my name buried somewhere in the details. She hadn't just erased me from her life. She'd built a business over the ashes of mine. I stayed up till dawn, eyes red, heart pounding, every memory replaying like a bad movie I couldn't turn off. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just a man who'd been left behind. I was a man buried alive, under lies, under paperwork, under the smiling faces of people who'd taken everything I ever loved and turned it into something ugly. But here's the thing about being buried. Sometimes all that pressure, all that weight, it doesn't kill you. Sometimes it forges you into something else. And as the sun came up that morning, I promised myself something simple, something cold, something that would keep me alive. Going back through boxes in the attic felt like digging up old bones. I put those boxes away for a reason: tax forms, old bank statements, canceled checks, letters with my daughter's handwriting in the margins. They were relics of a life that, until recently, I'd thought was straightforward. Work hard, provide, love your family. I hauled them down one rainy afternoon, the attic smell of dust and cedar filling my nose, and spread all of it across the kitchen table like evidence at a trial. I sat there for hours under the yellow light, sifting through years of paper until my fingers ached and the house grew quiet around me. At first it was routine: receipts, a warranty for the saw I'd bought in '98, a photocopy of a deed. Then I found the savings ledger I'd thought was long lost, the one I'd been careless enough to trust her with when Emily needed tuition money. Linda had promised at the time she'd transfer it back the next month, just until the semester starts, she'd said with that easy voice she had, the one that made everything sound reasonable. I remember the look in Emily's eyes when I handed over the slip, trust and relief, like I'd given her a little rope to climb with. I never imagined that rope would be used to pull me under. When I opened the ledger and matched it to the bank statements, the numbers didn't lie. The account had been emptied 5 years ago. Every balance, every deposit, every small variable I tracked for years gone, not a trickle left. I felt something hollow open up inside me, not like grief so much as the cold, mechanical click of betrayal. It was worse than being cheated on. Money could be replaced. Trust, the kind you hand over to the person you chose to spend your life with, could not. The ledger was a map of every plan I'd ever made. Vacations I'd imagined taking with Emily when she graduated, a motor that needed replacing in my truck, a small retirement cushion I'd hoped to pad, all erased with handwriting that wasn't mine. I called the bank the next morning pretending I'd misplaced the old records and needed a copy for taxes, the same polite script I'd used when I needed help opening a building account back in the '80s. The woman who answered was helpful in that way people are when they don't yet know the bad news they hold. "Let me check," she said, typing. The pause on the line felt like a door closing. When she came back on, her voice had a different color. "Mr. Hayes, there were transfers made to an account associated with J&L Home Improvements about 5 years ago. Large sums, direct deposit and some wire transfers. I can send copies of the statements to your address if you'd like." I told her yes and then sat down hard in my kitchen chair because the walls seemed to tilt. I stared at the phone in my shaking hand, the plastic sweating under my palm. J&L, my brain kept saying the name like a curse. J&L, Jake and Linda. There's a particular kind of rage that doesn't make you throw things or shout until your throat is raw. It sits behind your teeth and makes everything go quiet. You know the sound people make when they hold back a scream? That. I wasn't enraged in the way movies make it look dramatic. I was numb and sharp all at once, like a blade that had been tempered by cold and ready. My hands didn't tremble, my voice didn't crack when I hissed a curse under my breath. What happened next wasn't a fist pounding on doors. It was the silent, sober assembling of evidence. Planning, because planning is something a man with hands used to measuring, cutting, and building knows how to do. If their theft had been a structure, I would analyze its foundation and find the weak seams. They built a web of lies so practiced you think it was architecture. Laura, no, Linda had rewired financial access, plucked loose threads of my life, and tied them into a neat little knot she could pull when ready. Jake, with his smiling face and contractor's jargon, had been the second half of the operation, the visible underpinning that took the fall when needed and flashed a trusting storefront when the light was friendly. They used my old address on the company filings like a ghost from my past stalking my present. It wasn't sloppy, it was deliberate. Whoever had taught them how to hide in plain sight had done a good job. But the one mistake they made, the one thing they never accounted for, was that I know how things are built and I know how to take them apart. There's a certain pride you get after years of hard labor. You learn how to find the seam that frees a faulty wall, where to place your weight so the whole thing will shift and show its failings. I'd been a carpenter, a foreman, a man who could look at a crooked beam and know which nail to remove to have the whole crooked part fall without taking the house with it. I wasn't naive in love anymore, but I was still methodical in life. The betrayal that cut through me was personal and cheap, but the response I chose would be precise. Revenge, in my head then, wasn't about spectacle. It was about exposure. It was about unpicking the threads they'd pulled tight and showing everyone who they really were. I lay awake most of that night going back over the paperwork in my mind, visualizing their little operation like a shabby house built on wet soil. I traced every transaction I'd been able to see in my head and tried to imagine the rest. There were deposits into J and L's account that coincided with times Emily had texted me about being short on cash, with times I had agreed to help out, with times I'd trustingly believed my saved money was being used for school, for rent, for sensible things. Instead, it traced a different pattern: payments for tools, for upfront deposits on remodels that never happened, checks cashed immediately. The picture was ugly. People in our town trusted that contractors showed up honest. They trusted their neighbors. My name, the address of my old home, the past life I'd lived there, had been used to create that trust for them. It's funny what people remember under pressure. I remembered the sound of Linda's laugh when she'd said she'd take care of the finances. I remembered the small, polite way Jake would ask how I was doing, and then deflect when I asked about his projects. Those details, which used to feel normal and unimportant, began to look like clues. That cold, quiet rage became the engine of a plan. I started sketching steps on an old notepad, discreet things at first. Copies of the bank statements, of course. A list of clients Jake had boasted about, names and businesses to call. I thought about county records and registrations, about where the company was licensed, and who could be asked directly whether the work was performed. I thought about insurance claims and lien filings, and how a contractor with no completed jobs would likely lack proper paperwork. In my mind, a map was forming to lead straight to the truth. I didn't tell Emily any of this at first. What would I say? "Hey, sweetie, by the way, your soon-to-be husband and your mother stole my retirement." That would have sounded like bitterness, like a man clawing at ghosts. She already thought I was the villain. If I'd rushed to her with out-of-context anger, she'd only close more firmly around her chosen story. So I kept my mouth shut, collected the documents the bank sent, and started making quiet calls in the evenings when I knew no one would overhear. I reached out to Mike again and asked for anything else he could find on J and L's filings, and he came through like he always had: slow, thorough, loyal. That small, steady kindness felt like catching my breath. When I sat at the kitchen table with paperwork spread before me, I remember thinking about the years I'd given to building houses, framing beams, measuring twice, cutting once. There's a discipline to construction that applies to ripping down lies as well. You take a measured approach. You don't demolish the whole neighborhood. You find the rotten sill plate and you pry it out. Once that rotten piece is removed, the rest starts to shift and the truth reveals the work done beneath the layers. They had constructed their life like shoddy framing. They'd used my name and my past like a false permit. And now I had a choice. Let it stand and keep living under their roof of lies, or pull the one rotten beam and watch the whole mess start to fall apart. My hands were steady when I began to plan. There's something about being betrayed that snaps a kind of focus into place. The plan I began forming that night was not about vengeance in the theatrical sense. It was the work of a man who knows structures and knows how to dismantle them without collateral damage beyond exposing rot. I was cold and methodical because emotion had already done its work on me. It had harvested the heat, so what was left was a clear, ruthless logic. I would follow the money. I would follow the signatures. I would pull at the seam where all of their lies met and watch it rip slowly, publicly, in a way that would not be easy to ignore. If they thought using my life as scaffolding would leave me impotent, they were wrong. They had underestimated the stubbornness that comes from 58 years of work and a heart that refused to lie down. And so, sitting at that kitchen table, the house dark around me, the rain tracing slow paths down the window, I made my first quiet vow. I would get up out from under this grave of deceit and force the light to show what had been hidden. I would take that rotten beam out and let the false house collapse, so everyone could see the foundations it had been built upon. When the fog finally lifted enough for me to see, I realized the only thing standing between me and the truth was a pile of paper and a stubborn refusal to be quietly wronged. I didn't leap into theatrics. I did what felt natural, what I'd always done when faced with a crooked beam or a rotten joist. I measured, I tested, I started small. The plan began as tiny, careful steps that wouldn't draw attention but would let me learn. First, I needed information. Not the angry kind that only screams and scares people away, but the patient kind that sits in the quiet and waits for others to show you their cards. So I made a small lie to force the truth to show itself, the kind of lie that, when used carefully, is just an instrument. I set up a fake client, gave myself a name that sounded ordinary, a phone number from a prepaid card, an email made with a throwaway account. Nothing clever. Just enough to sound like someone who had money and a modest job for a local contractor. I called J and L Home Improvements and asked for a quote on a kitchen remodel, something mundane that would require them to write contracts, list materials, and if they were running the sort of business I suspected, ask for a deposit. I kept my voice steady, tried to sound clueless about construction but interested, asked the sorts of small questions real people ask, timelines, references, payment schedule. Jake's voice came through like always, polite, confident, practiced. He told me about warranties and scheduling and the name of a subcontractor who did great tile work. He emailed me an estimate that looked professional enough on the surface, logo at the top, itemized lines, a neat total with a 50% upfront request. That number stuck in my head. It wasn't astronomical, but it was enough that people in our town would hand it over without thinking twice. Over the following weeks, I kept pulling at that thread. I played the client, made more calls, sent more emails, asked for references that never materialized. Each time Jake promised to show up with a crew or to bring a check to the office, something would come up. A misplaced materials order, a problem with a subcontractor, a last-minute surgery in the family. Whatever the excuse, they were good at buying time. I recorded each call on an old tape recorder I'd bought when I used to shadow foremen for training. I kept copies of the estimates. I saved the emails. The mundane details, dates, times, promises, began to pile up into something that didn't look like a few clumsy lies anymore. It looked like a pattern. Pattern is what you look for when you're conditioned to see it. After 35 years of building and fixing, I could spot a shoddy job from a mile away. This wasn't shoddy. It was intentional. They were taking deposits, giving people timelines, then fatting away until the client either gave up or paid more to someone else to finish what had been started. I found an old woman 2 towns over whose porch had been started by J and L and left half-framed for months. I called her under the same fake name, asked about tile work Jake had promised, and she told me how he took her savings for materials and left, how she'd had to hire a nephew to finish the job. One by one, small testimonies added like drops filling a bucket. People didn't want drama, they wanted roofs that didn't leak. But their stories were the kind of quiet proof that, when gathered, becomes undeniable. And then there was the paperwork. That was the part that made my stomach turn. With Mike's help and a few quiet inquiries to people who owed me favors, the kind you build over years by being fair and paying what you owe, I began to get copies of filings and invoices. I traced deposit slips to account numbers. I matched client names with dates of promises. The J&L business account had deposits that lined up exactly with the times my savings had been drained. It was the kind of thing that, if an auditor looked at it, would make a neat line from my old account to theirs. The worst part was how clean they'd tried to make it look. Legitimate invoices, business receipts, fabricated subcontractor payments that went to shell accounts. It was organized enough that someone who didn't care would assume it was just good bookkeeping. but it hadn't been thorough enough for me. I'd spent a lifetime reading the sloppiness under people's smiles, the places where men who cut corners hoped nobody would see. Once I had enough to form a clear picture, the question became what to do with it. Rage had given way to purpose, and purpose favors precision. I didn't want to fight in the street. I didn't want screaming matches that only reinforced the narrative my daughter already believed, that I was bitter, a has-been, a meddling fool. I needed something that would force official attention without making me look like the angry father. So I built a neat folder, not with threats or declarations, but with documents, copies, and timelines. I printed bank statements showing the transfers from my old account, copies of the J&L invoices with deposit notes, emails where Jake promised work he never performed, affidavits from a few of the clients willing to speak quietly. I wrote nothing inflammatory on the cover. I wrote only one thing: anonymous complaint. The label felt like an act of professional restraint. It said in plain terms that I wasn't a man chasing revenge on a whim. I was someone bringing a case to light. Then came the slow, deliberate send. I did not hand the folder to any gossip-hungry neighbor. I didn't call the paper to run some scandalous feature. I chose the institutions that could not ignore the weight of paperwork. The county tax office, because taxes follow money and their interest would mean audits. The state licensing board, because contractors who take deposits and fail to complete work violate the rules and lose licenses. And the IRS, because money moving in a fraudulent way merged with my name could cause a furnace of questions that would light up every dark corner. I made copies, carefully labeled and organized, and sent them in separate envelopes from different post offices so there would be no easy trail back to me. I chose anonymity not out of cowardice but out of strategy. If I were to expose this, it needed to be the facts that did the talking, not my hurt voice begging for justice. After I mailed them, the waiting began. It was the hardest part. Waiting is its own discipline. You watch the world doing what it does, people mowing lawns, kids riding bikes, the wind bothering the last few leaves in fall, while you sit with an awful certainty that the tide you've turned has to come in on its own. I kept busy in the way men like me do. I took on small repairs for neighbors, fixed a fence, painted a porch. I kept my head down because I didn't want to seem like a spectacle. But inside, my chest buzzed with the quiet hum of expectation. I'd set a process in motion. Now I had to be patient enough to let it work. There were nights I second-guessed myself. I'd lie awake thinking of Emily's face when she found out what I'd done. Would she see it as betrayal? Would she think I'd gone too far? The hurt of the phone call still sat in my bones, and sometimes, even in the quiet confidence of planning, I wondered if I'd become the very thing I hated, a man consumed by himself. But every time doubt crept in, I'd remember the ledger, the empty account I'd trusted with her future. I'd remember the motel sign and the way Jake's laughter had sounded with Linda beside him. The doubt would melt, and my resolve would harden. And then came the first sign that the world might be listening. A week after the envelopes were mailed, someone from the county called a neighbor who owed me a small favor. Word traveled that there were compliance questions about J&L 2 weeks later. I learned through a third party that the state licensing board had put a temporary hold on the company's license pending review. Small shocks, ripple effects, they weren't headlines. They were the kind of bureaucratic movements that feel slow, but are unstoppable once set rolling. I heard nothing directly, didn't want to, but it was enough to make my heart beat a little steadier at night. But I didn't celebrate, not in any loud way. There was no gloating, no triumphant calls. The idea wasn't to watch them suffer in front of everyone. It was to clean the mess they had made and make sure no one else fell for it. I'd been robbed, yes, but it wasn't money alone. It was the theft of reputation, the manipulation of community trust that contractors live on. So I waited, keeping my hands busy, my head low, and my notebook of dates close at hand. The plan was simple enough. Follow the money, collect the evidence, hand it to institutions that could compel answers. I had no illusions about it being pretty. Truth never is, but truth is durable. Lies, no matter how well built, settle on weaker foundations. And if I knew one thing from a life built on timber and nails, it was this: find the rotten wood, pry it out, and the rest will follow. By the time the calendar told me there were only 3 weeks left until the wedding, the neat little life I'd been clinging to like a talisman had begun to unravel in ways that felt almost clinical. I mailed folders, watched the slow bureaucratic machinery of county and state creak into motion, and then, like a quiet thunderstorm that gathers strength until it becomes impossible to ignore, small announcements started coming my way, not by phone or polite knock, but in the no sound of things changing. Jake's business, J&L Home Improvements, was flagged. Papers were stamped. Notices started circulating like a bad rumor with the authority of government stationery behind it. Accounts were frozen. That phrase felt surreal in my mouth when Mike told me over coffee at the diner. They put holds on the accounts, Rick. Looks like they're looking into cash flows, deposits, odd transfers. He said it in that soft voice of his, as if he were sharing news about a neighbor's dog that had wandered off, not the revelation that would ripple through an entire family. I sat there, drinking my coffee cold, and felt a peculiar mixture of vindication and sorrow, like watching a building you once admired being condemned because you knew the rot was there all along. When the bank put a freeze on J&L's account, it was like flipping a light switch in a house. Suddenly, the shadows that had been lurking in corners were lit up for everyone to see. Vendors who'd once answered Jake's calls with that deferential tone now asked for proof of insurance and proper permits before they'd consider scheduling work. A couple of clients I'd spoken with finally got calls back from the tax office asking for receipts and explanations. Word moves fast in a town the size of ours, and gossip, which had been the dull, dangerous whisper behind closed doors, began to have the edge of official concern. Linda's panic was the first human sign that the machine I'd started had teeth. She called Emily at odd hours, voice thin and sharp when I later heard recordings through a mutual acquaintance. She was packing, pleading, promising explanations. The woman who once handled our finances with quiet competency was now a different creature. The calm was gone, and in its place a frantic slapping at loose ends. Her texts to Jake were a frantic scatter of capital letters and exclamation points. His at first were clipped and measured, then defensive, then oddly hollow. Through it all, Emily reached out to me like the tide trying to find the shore after a storm. Her calls came in waves, missed, returned, cut off. I let them ring. There's a hard line a man draws when the pain is sharp and the wound is too raw to be touched. My phone buzzed and my heart jumped every time, but I kept it face down on the table. Her name would flash on the screen and I would sweat like a man seen by a former lover, like someone caught sleeping on a job. People ask why a father doesn't answer when his child reaches out. It's easier to ask than to explain. The truth was simple and ugly. The last thing I wanted was to hear her voice and find her defending the people who'd folded my life into a paper boat and set it adrift. I had seen the motel door close. I had sat at the kitchen table with the ledger spread out like an accusation. I was tired of being the character in someone else's rewrite of my life. Then one morning an envelope arrived, not an email, not a text, but a letter with my name written on it in Emily's careful hand. There's something unpretentious about paper. It carries its own gravity. I opened it at the sink with my back to the window, the rain outside making slow patterns on the glass. Her words were small and honest and frightening, not a defense but a plea. "Dad," she wrote, "please come. I don't know what's happening. Jake's acting strange." She didn't say sorry. She didn't say I was wrong. She said she didn't understand. And that, more than the silence or the prior insult of exclusion, reached out and hit me where I lived. I didn't reply. I didn't write back. I folded the letter and placed it in the pocket of my shirt like a talisman or a threat. I couldn't tell which. I knew, as surely as I knew how to set a joist, that the right move required patience and precision. The temptation to confront, to drive over and knock, to burst through the apartment door and demand truth like a man whose whole life hangs on a hinge, was a pain that made my teeth ache. But the plan I'd set in motion was not a tempest of emotion. It was the slow, inexorable pressure of consequence. The institutions I'd contacted don't move because a man shows up angry. They move because paperwork and protocol do not ignore facts once presented. If I stormed in, if I became the spectacle, their version of events, the story where I was the vindictive father who wouldn't let his daughter live her life, might find new currency. I had seen too many small towns swallow rumors like gospel. I would not feed them that lie. Still, I was going, not as a guest with a smile, not as a defeated man nursing his heartbreak. I was going as something else, an arrival with purpose that could not be dismissed. I envisioned myself in the pews in the back, a quietly present force. I would walk down the aisle if I had to, not because I'd be requested, but because the moment that priest asked if anyone had reason not to allow this union would be a moment like a hinge exposed to pressure. I had laid a map of their lies on the table, and now I would let the institution start to pull at the corners. Exposure, I thought, is the sharpest thing in a man's hand when he's been cut deeply. There is a difference between vindictiveness and accountability. The latter seeks to redress wrongs so they aren't repeated. I told myself that truth even when my hands shook in the church's shadow of possibility. Between then and the day I planned to go, the town shifted its whispering tone. People who'd previously gossiped at the hardware store began to look at me with a new curiosity, not pity, not yet, but an unsettled glance that said they were waiting to see who would prove right. Jake's calls to old clients began to sound defensive. Linda's steps, which I could picture vividly, grew hurried and furtive. Emily's friends poked at me gently, trying to reconcile what they knew of the charming, quiet man she loved with what whispers in town implied. I kept working on neighbors' porches, painting fences, fixing gutters, as if mere productivity could buffer me from the raw building at the edges of my life. I cut wood with the same precise rhythm I always had, each measured stroke a kind of prayer. I crafted excuses that kept me anonymous, small jobs, community help, because I needed to be present but not present in a way that gave them ammunition to write their own versions of me. I rehearsed what I might say 100 different ways on the drive to the church. Sometimes I imagined a quiet telling, "Here are the papers, sir, look at them," and the priest would close his eyes and say, "We will not permit this union." Other times I saw the opposite, Emily in tears, furious, accusing me of ruining her life, her voice a knife. But I kept coming back to the letter in my pocket and the looks on the faces of men at the county office when I'd asked about filings. They had the look of men who'd been told a story and now suspected there was a different version. The systems were already stirring, bureaucracy inching into motion on my behalf. I did not need to shout. I needed to be there when the right question would be asked. Sitting behind the wheel the morning of the wedding, I felt a fury that was quiet but enormous, a two-headed thing. The hurt fury for what had been taken from me and the righteous fury for the truth I intended to set loose. The sky that day was thin and pale, like tissue paper stretched over something stronger. I drove slow, the radio off, my hands on the wheel remembering the feel of a hammer, the weight of a nail. I thought of all the little lies that scaffolded what they'd built. Small transfers here and there, promises kept only on paper, affection that looked sincere but was a mask for a ledger. I thought about Emily walking down an aisle she might later wish she'd never seen, steps carrying her toward a life built on someone else's falsehoods. I thought about the priest, about the words he would say, about the moment where moral authority meets human weakness. When I pulled into the church parking lot, people were already arriving. Bridesmaids in pastel, men in rented suits with nervous smiles. The scent of flowers hung in the air, saccharine and sweet, and something like grief tasted of it. For a moment, the entire sick business of everything I'd been living with felt unreal, like I'd wandered into someone else's dream. I sat in the car for a long minute, hands folded on the steering wheel, heart beating in a rhythm I didn't recognize, listening to the muffled swirl of voices inside the building. I did not want to be a spectacle. I wanted to be an instrument. I wanted the truth to be the thing that interrupted the ceremony, not me. But I also knew that when the priest asked if anyone had cause to object, I would stand and let the documents I had sent do the speaking. They would not be anonymous in the way I'd hoped if I stood up. They would be undeniable. So I stepped out of the car with the letter still in my pocket, folded and safe, and walked toward the church like a man walking into a storm he had called upon himself. I had been patient and methodical. I had let the machine work. Now, at the hinge of ceremony and consequence, I prepared to see whether the structure they'd built could bear the light of what I knew. I moved slowly, each step a small victory of will, the will to face what had been done to me, and the will to bring it into a public place where it could be judged. I did not rush. I did not shout. I walked with a purpose that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with truth. The morning of the wedding felt like the kind of calm that sits heavy before a storm. You know that quiet when birds don't sing, when even the wind seems to hesitate, waiting for something to happen. I woke up before the sun, sat at the kitchen table, and poured myself a cup of black coffee that went cold before I took a sip. My hands were steady, but inside, I could feel something moving, not nerves exactly, but a deep, quiet certainty. The kind that comes when you've already lost everything that mattered, and all that's left is truth. The suit I wore that day was the same one I'd worn to my mother's funeral 20 years ago. I never bought another because I never thought I'd need one. I brushed off the dust, straightened the collar, looked at myself in the mirror. The man staring back looked older than I remembered. 58, but with the eyes of someone who'd lived twice that. My reflection wasn't the father I used to be, warm, patient, hopeful. It was a man sharpened by betrayal. A man who'd been buried alive under lies, and had dug his way out one handful of dirt at a time. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the kind that bites at your cheeks. The church was only 15 minutes away, but I drove slow, the road stretching out like a film reel before me. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt, like gravity was stronger there, like the universe itself knew what was about to happen. The church came into view, small but beautiful, white stone walls, a bell tower, rows of cars parked outside, ribbons tied to side mirrors. The sound of distant laughter floated through the open doors. I parked at the far edge of the lot, away from the crowd, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment. My heart was steady, but my mind was racing, memories flickering through like ghosts. Emily's first dance recital, her high school graduation, the way she'd run to me when she scraped her knee. And then the phone call, her voice, cold and distant. "Don't come to the wedding." I smiled faintly. "Sorry, sweetheart," I whispered to no one, "but I'm coming." Inside, the church smelled of lilies and polish. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, scattering colors across the pews. The organ played softly. I walked in quietly, staying near the back where shadows met the light. No one noticed me. They were too busy smiling, whispering, watching the aisle where my daughter, my little girl, was about to walk toward a man who had torn my life apart. Emily looked beautiful, painfully beautiful. She wore her mother's old veil, the same one Linda had worn the day she married me. That sight hit me harder than I expected. It was like a cruel echo from a life that once held love. Her smile trembled, nervous but trying to be brave. I could tell she hadn't slept much. Her eyes, even behind that thin veil, looked tired, haunted. Maybe, deep down, she already knew this day would end differently than she'd planned. Jake stood at the altar, polished and perfect, his hair slicked back, suit crisp. To anyone else, he looked like the kind of man every father would be proud to see his daughter marry. But to me, he looked like rot under paint, something dressed up to hide the stench. And beside him, at the front row, sat Linda, my ex-wife. Her hands clasped together in fake grace, pretending she didn't see me slip into the back row. But when her eyes found me, even for a second, I saw it, the color draining from her face. The ceremony began. The priest spoke the same words I'd heard at my own wedding decades ago. Promises, blessings, forever. I sat there, motionless, listening to the words that once meant everything and now sounded like lies. Then came the moment. "If anyone here knows any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony," the priest said, his voice echoing through the hall, "Speak now, or forever hold your peace." For a heartbeat, silence filled the room, that heavy, expectant kind of silence that feels like the world is holding its breath. Then I stood up. Every head turned, chairs creaked, a murmur spread through the crowd like a gust of wind. Emily's veil shifted as she gasped, her hand going to her mouth. Jake froze mid-smile, the color in his face fading fast. And Linda, she went pale as a ghost, her hands trembling, clutching the pew like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I didn't rush. I took my time walking down the aisle, each step echoing in the quiet church. It wasn't a march of anger, it was something steadier, heavier. The sound of a man reclaiming what was stolen from him. When I reached the front, I looked at Emily first. She looked at me like she'd seen a ghost. I wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that I loved her, that none of this was her fault, but that moment had passed months ago. I turned to Jake. "Yeah," I said, my voice calm but strong enough to carry through the entire room. "I've got a reason." You could hear a pin drop. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a thick brown envelope. It was worn at the corners, creased from being handled too much. I placed it gently on the altar, right between Jake and the priest. "Before you marry him," I said, looking straight at my daughter, "you might want to know he's been sleeping with your mother, and they've been running a fraud business in my name." The words hit like thunder. Gasps filled the church. A few people actually stood up. The priest stepped back, eyes wide, uncertain if this was real or some kind of cruel interruption. Emily's bouquet slipped from her hands and hit the floor. She shook her head in disbelief, whispering, "No, no," her voice cracked. She turned toward Jake, eyes searching for denial, for explanation, for anything. Jake tried to speak, his mouth open then closed again, his jaw tightening. "It's not," he started. "Save it, son," I said, cutting him off. "The IRS already has your paperwork. You'll be seeing them soon." The priest blinked, unsure what to do. Guests began murmuring, voices overlapping in confusion, in shock. Some pulled out their phones. Others stood frozen, watching the family unravel before them like a slow-motion car crash. Linda stood up suddenly, her chair screeching against the floor. She tried to say something, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted around, wild, desperate, like a cornered animal. Then she turned and ran right out of the church doors, her heels clattering on the stone floor. Emily fell to her knees, crying deep, broken sobs that echoed in the silent church. Jake tried to reach for her, but she pushed him away, shouting something between tears I couldn't quite make out. And me? I just stood there. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel shame. I didn't even feel victory, just peace. A deep, quiet peace that settled in my bones. Because in that moment, I realized I didn't ruin anything. I didn't destroy my daughter's wedding. The truth did. All I did was open the door and let it walk in. I turned, walked back down the aisle the way I'd come. Every eye followed me, but I didn't meet their gaze. Outside, the sunlight felt different, sharper, cleaner, like the world had been scrubbed of a layer of lies. I took a long breath, exhaled slow, and for the first time in a long time, the air didn't hurt to breathe. Behind me, I heard shouting Jake, the priest, someone calling Emily's name, but I didn't turn around. The church doors closed, and with them, that chapter of my life. I didn't go there for revenge. I went there for the truth. And the truth, as they say, always shows up, even if it takes walking through hell to deliver it. It all came crashing down in ways that were messy, public, and strangely poetic. The kind of fall that doesn't announce itself with a roar, but with the steady clatter of consequences catching up to the guilty. By the following week, the town was alive with whispers that no one could contain. Every corner cafe, every grocery line, every whispered conversation in the pews seemed to hum with the same news. J&L Home Improvements, once a small but seemingly respectable business, had been seized. Accounts frozen, licenses suspended, assets temporarily confiscated. And in the paperwork, in the dry, official language that left no room for interpretation, Linda Hayes was charged with fraud. I watched it all unfold like a man observing a slow-motion demolition. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters who had smelled scandal from miles away. Photographs of Jake's slick smile and Linda's pale panic graced the local news site for weeks. Social media, that relentless mirror, reflected their shame for anyone to see. But I did not gloat. Not because I'm a saint, far from it, but because this kind of victory tastes bitter if it's seasoned with schadenfreude. I had acted out of necessity, out of a quiet insistence on truth, and there was enough of that truth floating around to let it speak for itself. Emily vanished from the public eye. I suppose the combination of shock, embarrassment, and heartbreak drove her to pack up what little she could and move out of state. She rented a small apartment in a city far from the sticky echoes of our town, a place where she could breathe without whispers following her, where she could start over without seeing the faces of people who had unknowingly watched her trust being manipulated. She began therapy soon after, talking through the cracks that betrayal had carved in her heart. I couldn't force her recovery, couldn't hug away the hurt, but I could be patient and present in the ways a father can be, waiting for her to find her footing again. Months passed. Time had a way of stretching and compressing simultaneously, long, lonely evenings followed by fleeting hours of quiet hope. Then one evening my phone rang. The name flashing on the screen made my chest tight. "Emily," it said. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring twice, just long enough to summon the courage to speak without my voice trembling. Then I pressed the green button, and there she was, a little older, a little quieter, but still my daughter. "Dad," her voice broke, a trembling wisp of sound that carried months of guilt, fear, and relief all at once. I'm so sorry. I didn't know how deep it went." I swallowed, feeling the lump in my throat. For years I'd imagined this moment in countless ways, some dark, some hopeful, some impossibly distant. And now here it was, fragile, real, and achingly human. "Sweetheart," I said softly, letting my voice be steady even as my chest tightened, "betrayal blinds you. It blinds good people too. It doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It just happens." We spoke for hours. I told her little stories of our past, the way she used to insist on eating cereal for dinner when Mom was late from work, the time she tried to convince me that she could teach the dog algebra, the moments that had seemed inconsequential but were stitched into the tapestry of our life together. And slowly, carefully, Emily began to respond. Her laughter was tentative at first, like a bird testing the air before taking flight. Her tears came freely, but they were not just for heartbreak. They were for relief, recognition, and the beginning of understanding. We went piece by piece, patching the gaps that betrayal had torn. Conversations became a nightly ritual, filled with quiet admissions, regrets, and the awkward, precious rebuilding of trust. She told me about her fears, her doubts, the long nights she'd spent questioning everything she believed about people she trusted most. I shared my own mistakes, my own regrets, and how I had let anger and suspicion shape me in ways I hadn't recognized until it was almost too late. Months turned into a rhythm of healing. We learned how to talk again, how to sit in silence without tension, how to hold a hand across a table without words, and understand that presence itself was sometimes enough. Slowly, Emily came back to me, not fully restored. Healing takes time, but real, breathing, and willing to rebuild what had been nearly destroyed. The town still whispered. Jake and Linda were a cautionary tale in a dozen conversations, a headline in the local paper, a story of deception and collapse. But my daughter and I, we found a quiet corner in the ruins. There was no grand celebration, no parade down Main Street. Just phone calls, visits, laughter that returned slowly but genuinely, and the simple knowledge that, for all the lies that had been spun around us, the truth had finally settled where it belonged. And I realized something important in that long stretch of months. Revenge is not always about satisfaction. Sometimes it is about restoration. Sometimes it is about making the wrongs so visible, so undeniable, that the world itself begins to right them. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give the person you love most is the courage to trust again, first in the world, then in the people who matter most. When Emily finally visited, the hug she gave me didn't need words. It carried months of sorrow, relief, and love. And in that embrace, I felt a peace that had eluded me for years. The fall had been brutal for those who betrayed us, but for my daughter and me, it was a rise, a long, slow climb out of darkness into light. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope. Revenge isn't loud. It doesn't need fireworks, speeches, or anyone applauding from the sidelines. True revenge, the kind that leaves your heart unburdened and your soul intact, is quiet. It's the stillness after the storm, the work you do with your hands and mind that reminds you life goes on, and this time it goes on your terms. I didn't gloat. I didn't stand on the rooftops and shout about what had been exposed, what had been taken down, what had finally been made right. Because that is revenge, that's performance. And I wasn't performing for anyone. I was reclaiming my world piece by piece, and that was enough. I started small, almost imperceptibly. My old truck, a rust-speckled Ford I'd driven for decades, had been sitting in the driveway, tires flat, engine coughing whenever I tried to start it. I spent long afternoons tinkering under the hood, tightening bolts, changing fluids, replacing worn parts. Each turn of the wrench, each spark from the starter felt symbolic, a quiet reclamation of control, a reminder that I could fix things when they were broken, that some things could be saved. The truck, once a hunk of metal stranded in my driveway, began to hum again like a living thing, and I felt a subtle satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumph over anyone else, and everything to do with the rhythm of work bringing peace to a restless heart. Next came the garden. I had always loved flowers, but the years of turmoil had left the front yard looking neglected, grass growing in stubborn patches, weeds claiming territory, the flower beds empty and dusty. I planted perennials that would bloom year after year, roses with thorns that reminded me of endurance, daisies that caught sunlight like tiny stars. I watered them carefully, spoke to them sometimes, joking aloud that maybe they'd hold grudges too if I wasn't careful. And in doing so, I felt life returning to the spaces I'd once let slip into shadow. Every leaf that unfurled, every petal that caught the morning light, was a quiet affirmation that growth could happen again, even after betrayal. Then there was the porch. The same porch where the call came, where my hands first trembled, where my heart first felt the weight of exclusion needed work. The wood was warped, paint peeling, nails loose from years of wear. I stripped it back to its bare frame and began rebuilding. With each hammer strike, each measured cut of lumber, I wasn't just repairing the porch. I was reclaiming the past, reshaping it, asserting that even in the place where betrayal had first cut its mark, something strong and true could stand. It took days, weeks even. I sanded until my fingers ached, painted until the sun was low, stained the wood until it shone like a promise. By the time the last board was secured, the porch didn't just look new, it felt like a chapter finally closed. Neighbors noticed, as they always do. Folks would come by for small talk, standing at the edge of the driveway or leaning over the fence. "You doing okay, Rick?" they ask, their voices soft with curiosity and concern. I'd look up, brush sawdust from my shirt, smile in that easy, natural way that comes when a man finally stops carrying the weight of someone else's lies. "Better than ever," I'd say. And it wasn't bravado, it wasn't performance, it wasn't even meant for them, it was true. I was better. Stronger, whole in a way I hadn't felt in years. Evenings became my sanctuary. I'd sit on that new porch with the old truck parked nearby, a glass of lemonade in hand, listening to the quiet hum of a neighborhood settling into night. The wind whispered through the trees, the sky turned deep blue, and for the first time in months, maybe even years, the past felt like it belonged behind me, not lodged in my chest. I thought about Emily, about how far she'd come, about how trust could be rebuilt when nurtured carefully, about how the people who had tried to take everything had only shown me how much I was capable of holding on to. Quiet revenge doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't leave scars on others, it leaves peace on you. That porch, those flowers, the truck, the rhythm of work and presence, that was my revenge. Every nail I drove in, every seed I planted, every engine I coaxed to life felt like a stitch closing the wounds left behind, sewing strength back into the fabric of my days. And sometimes, when the wind carried the faint sound of children playing down the street, or when a neighbor smiled and waved as they walked by, I would just sit back, take a deep breath and think, yeah, this is enough, better than ever. Because revenge is not about the fall of others, it's about the rise of yourself. And in that quiet, sunlit yard with the house stable and the porch hole, I had finally risen. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to my story to understand, it's this. Revenge isn't always a storm. It isn't always a firestorm that leaves ashes behind. Sometimes revenge is quiet. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's clarity. And clarity is a weapon sharper than any rage, stronger than any shouting, more unrelenting than any grudge. The people who betray you, the ones who weave lies, who hide truths, who use affection as a mask for manipulation, they want you to be angry. They feed off the heat of your fury, the trembling of your hands, the loud proclamations of your pain. They believe anger is the only response, and in that they are wrong. Anger blinds you. It makes you sloppy, reckless, predictable. It gives them the upper hand even when they've done everything wrong. They count on it. And that's why patience is the most dangerous kind of revenge. Patience lets you see clearly, plan carefully, and act when the timing cannot be ignored. It lets you stand unshaken when the world expects you to collapse. I learned this the hard way, of course. I had my moments of fury, nights lying awake replaying the motel door, the letters, the lies over and over, feeling my chest tighten until I thought it might split. But I held on to clarity. I watched. I listened. I learned. I acted in ways that left truth as my ally in the law, the system, and time as my instruments. When everything finally unraveled, when Jake's company collapsed, when Linda's web of lies was exposed, when my daughter finally saw the truth, it wasn't because I had yelled or raged. It was because I had been steady, quiet, patient, clear. And in that steadiness I found peace. Not the kind that comes from vengeance or triumph over another, but the kind that comes from knowing you acted right. The kind that lets you breathe again without carrying the weight of betrayal in your chest. I rebuilt more than a porch or a truck or a yard. I rebuilt my life, my trust in myself, my ability to act with honor, even when the world had treated me dishonorably. My daughter and I, we talk every Sunday now. It's ritual. She calls from wherever she is, and we talk for hours about her work, about my projects, about dreams and fears we never shared when life was full of distraction and deceit. Sometimes she cries, sometimes I do. Sometimes we laugh until our voices crack. We are healing. She is learning to trust again. And in guiding her, I am reminded that the right actions, the patient, steady, truthful ones, can restore far more than anger ever could. And every time I hear the sound of church bells, I smile. Not from bitterness, not from desire for payback, not from dwelling on the wrongs of the past. I smile because the world reminded me, in its own slow, stubborn way, that integrity matters, that truth has power, that patience can dismantle even the most carefully constructed lies. And I smile because I remember that day so vividly. The light streaming through the stained glass, the scent of lilies, the hush of the congregation, and the question the priest asked, the one that should have been ordinary, routine, ceremonial. Is there anyone who objects to this union? I stood up, and when I did, it was not out of vengeance. It was not for pride. It was for clarity, for justice, for the truth that had been hidden behind whispers and smiles. I stood up for myself, for my daughter, for the life we deserved. That moment, frozen in time, taught me the deepest lesson, that standing up isn't always loud, that the strongest power isn't in destruction but in revelation, that the peace you find after enduring betrayal is sweeter than any anger, sharper than any hatred, and lasting far longer than any fleeting victory. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: hold your patience, trust your clarity, let time and truth be your allies. And when the moment comes to stand, stand not with fury, but with the calm certainty that you are right, that you are honest, and that no one, no matter how clever their deception, can touch the integrity you have rebuilt for yourself. Because that day, when the priest asked for the bride's father, I finally stood up, not just for a wedding, not just for my daughter, but for myself. And that, my friends, made all the difference.